It begins, as these stories so often do, with something deceptively ordinary. A painting. Oil on canvas. A young woman in a high-waisted dress of pale green, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her hair, the color of burnished chestnut, is drawn back in a style that seems both archaic and, somehow ahead of its time. Her eyes, an unsettling shade between gray and blue, hold an expression the brush cannot quite capture. It is not serenity, though at first glance it appears so. It is not sadness, though the faint downturn of her lips might suggest it. It is something stranger, as if she knows something we do not. The portrait hangs in a dimly lit chamber in the back of a private collection, far from the hushed footsteps of museum visitors. There is no glass over it. No placard explaining the sitter's name, no tidy description of its historical context. Only a small brass plate at the bottom of the gilded frame bears an inscription, 1792. The trouble is, what makes this painting more than another relic of genteel history, is that the face in it belongs to someone who could not possibly have sat for it. Because, as archived birth records, photographs, and personal testimonies will later confirm, she was not born until the year 1892. This is not merely a resemblance. It is not a matter of a passing similarity in jawline or hairstyle. This is her, down to the soft cleft in the chin, the delicate scar just above her right eyebrow, and the precise asymmetry in the curve of her smile. To look upon the painting, and then upon the photographs of the woman in question, is to be confronted with a kind of visual certainty that refuses dismissal. It is the sort of thing that makes the rational mind flinch, reaching instinctively for an explanation. Coincidence. A trick of light and proportion. The painter's imagination accidentally aligning with the features of someone not yet born. Or perhaps, surely more likely, a forgery, backdated to give the illusion of age. And yet, the pigment tells another story. The linen weave of the canvas matches production methods used in the late 18th century. The underpainting bears the subtle lead-based whites abandoned by the mid-19th century for health reasons. Even the varnish, when tested decades later, reveals the brittle, ambered chemistry of something that has aged well over 2 centuries. The first time I saw the portrait, really saw it, I was standing in that quiet room, the smell of aged wood and drying varnish lingering in the air. The curator, a man with the cautious manner of someone who handles dangerous things without calling them dangerous, said only, "Look long enough, and she'll look back." I did. And though the rational part of me resisted, there was a point where I felt, not imagined, but felt, her gaze shift. Not in a literal, mechanical sense, but in a way that suggested awareness. As though she recognized me. Not me, specifically, but the act of being looked at across time. For the family that once owned the portrait, this was not a matter of abstract curiosity. In 1792, it was simply an image of an unknown young woman, painted by an eccentric but skilled portraitist. By the end of that year, it had become something whispered about in the household. By the start of the next, it was locked away. And within a few months more, the family was gone, estate sold, possessions scattered, their name fading from parish records. If the story had ended there, the portrait would have been a forgotten oddity, a relic buried in some attic. But fate, or something more deliberate, had other plans. Nearly a century later, in 1893, the painting surfaced again. And this time, the world was ready to take notice. The newspapers called it a curiosity. Art critics called it a puzzle. And the woman, born in 1892, with the same features as the sitter, called it something she refused to name aloud. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the power of this image, we must return to the time of its making. To the year 1792, a year balanced between the rational Enlightenment and the lingering shadows of superstition. A time when the French Revolution thundered across the Channel in headlines, while in the quiet lanes of rural England, parish gossip still carried as much weight as printed news. Somewhere in that tension, in that strange historical half-light, a painter took up his brush and captured a face that should not have been there. A face from the future. The room in which he worked would have been lit not by electricity, but by the long, steady burn of tallow candles and the angled daylight spilling through a tall window. The scent of oil paints, linseed, turpentine, would mingle with the faint dampness of the countryside air. He was known, even then, for his meticulous attention to detail. His portraits were not stiff, formal imitations of life, they breathed. They caught the smallest, most human expressions. And so he painted her, whoever she was, with that same fidelity. But he painted more than her likeness. He painted something the century could not yet hold. The brushstroke that shouldn't exist remains there still, locked in the folds of her dress, in the curve of her half-smile. The science of pigment analysis may chart its chemistry, the historians may trace the line of ownership, and the skeptics may line up their explanations like so many chess pieces. But the fact remains, in 1792, a painter signed his name to the portrait of a woman who would not draw her first breath until 100 years later. Perhaps it is a coincidence so vast and uncanny that it collapses into inevitability. Or perhaps it is a message. Not from the painter, nor from the sitter, but from the quiet, unseen currents that sometimes carry the future into the past, if only for the span of a single human gaze. And when you stand before her, as I once did, you will understand why the curator said what he said. Because there is a moment when her eyes seem to change, not in shape or color, but in depth. And you will find yourself looking into the eyes of someone who should not know you, yet somehow does. In that moment, you will feel the centuries thin between you, until the only thing that exists is her presence, and the whisper of a question that refuses to die: how can a portrait remember a life it has not yet seen? To understand the mystery of the portrait, we must first step into the world that birthed it, a world balanced on the edge of change, yet still anchored in traditions that seemed eternal. The year was 1792. Across Europe, the old order trembled under the weight of revolution. France had executed its king in all but name, the streets of Paris ran with both rhetoric and blood. In England, however, life in the countryside moved at its own, slower rhythm. Political unrest was something to be discussed in drawing rooms, not lived. The great houses of the landed gentry still stood, their tall chimneys smoking against grey skies, their gardens trimmed with the precision of centuries. In such a house, Hartwell Manor, our story begins. Built in the mid-17th century, the manor was not the grandest in England, but it was old, and that age carried a certain authority. It sat on a low rise above the village, its red brick facade softened by ivy, its windows glinting faintly in the pale winter light. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke from the kitchen hearth and damp earth from the surrounding fields. Inside, the rooms were filled with the scent of beeswax and polish, the hush of thick carpets underfoot, and the occasional creak of wood settling in the cold. The family who owned Hartwell were not famous. They did not appear in London society columns or scandal sheets. The patriarch, Henry Lavington, was a man of moderate wealth but considerable pride, descended from a long line of landowners who prized discretion above display. His wife, Margaret, was known for her quiet beauty and her devout adherence to the Church of England. Their lives were marked by the usual rhythms of estate management, tenant disputes, harvest yields, seasonal hunts, until the winter of 1792, when Henry decided to commission a portrait. Portraiture, in those days, was more than vanity. It was a statement of legacy, a way to capture one's image for posterity in an age before photography. The painter chosen for this task was Mr. Elias Turner, a man whose reputation was peculiar, and whose name carried whispers not often spoken in polite company. Turner was not a London man. Born the son of a provincial clockmaker, he had learned his trade in the studios of more celebrated artists, but it was said he had an eye for more than the visible. His sitters were often startled by how his work seemed to reveal something they had not shown him, an expression half hidden in their own minds, a detail that felt too intimate to have been observed in the studio. Some called it genius. Others called it unsettling. He was, by all accounts, a private man. He dressed simply, spoke sparingly, and had a habit of pausing mid-conversation, as if listening to something distant and faint. It was also noted that he rarely sketched his subjects in the conventional way. Instead, he would spend hours in silent observation before ever picking up a brush, as if memorizing them, not their posture or attire, but something deeper. Henry Lavington met Turner by chance during a visit to a neighboring estate. A recently completed portrait of the host's daughter caught his attention, not for its beauty, though it was beautiful, but for the peculiar vitality in the girl's eyes. It was as if she were not merely represented, but present. On impulse, Henry arranged for Turner to come to Hartwell. The initial plan, so far as the household understood it, was for a family group portrait, Henry, Margaret, and their 2 young sons. But when Turner arrived in the crisp, frost-bitten morning of late January, his gaze wandered. It lingered on corners, on windows, on empty chairs. And finally, it settled, though no one could later agree on exactly where. For days, Turner toured the house, sketchbook in hand, though those who peered over his shoulder swore the pages were blank. He dined politely, spoke little, and seemed to watch the family with a kind of distracted intensity. Then, one evening, he made a request that puzzled them. He wished to paint not the family group, but a single portrait, of a young woman. When Henry asked which young woman, Turner smiled faintly and said, "You will know her when you see her." Margaret assumed he meant a visiting cousin or a local acquaintance. The servants whispered that perhaps the Lavingtons were keeping some relative hidden from view, as sometimes happened with those afflicted by illness or scandal. But no such person existed, or so they thought. Turner set up his easel in the south drawing-room, where the afternoon light was soft and lingering. For 3 days, no one saw his sitter arrive or depart. Meals were brought to him, and the door remained closed. Once, a maid claimed she heard a woman's voice from within, low, steady, and strangely melodic. But when she pressed her ear closer, there was only the faint scratch of a brush on canvas. By the end of the week, the portrait was finished. Turner worked with an urgency that startled the household. He refused to let anyone view the canvas until the varnish had set, and when at last it was revealed, the effect was immediate and unsettling. The woman was a stranger to them all, yet there was something in her gaze that made it impossible to look away. Henry was pleased, but confused. Margaret was silent. The servants avoided the room in which it hung. Turner, for his part, offered no explanation. He simply accepted his payment, wrapped his brushes in cloth, and departed, leaving behind the image that would trouble the family for generations. It would be easy, now, to imagine that they knew something was amiss, that they felt the weight of the impossible even then. But in truth, the full strangeness of the portrait had not yet revealed itself. That would come later, when time itself would seem to bend, and the woman in the painting would step, impossibly, into life. In the winter months of 1792, visitors to Hartwell Manor were rare. The roads were often little more than rutted tracks, thick with mud or frozen solid beneath a skin of ice. Those who came calling did so by arrangement, their carriages announced by the crunch of wheels on gravel and the clatter of hooves at the great iron gates. Which is why it was so strange that no one saw her arrive. The household staff would later argue about the first sighting. Some swore they saw her step from a small black carriage one misty morning, the kind hired from market towns rather than owned outright. Others insisted they glimpsed her walking up the long drive alone, her pale green dress catching the winter light like river water. One or two claimed, quietly, almost fearfully, that they had seen her standing in the south garden before dawn, motionless among the frost-dusted hedges. No one knew her name. The family offered no introductions. Margaret Lavington, normally precise in matters of etiquette, made no mention of a guest in her letters that week. Henry, when asked by the steward, simply said, "She will be staying for a short while." The matter was dropped, as matters were in such houses when curiosity brushed too close to the private affairs of the gentry. She was young, perhaps 20, though her face bore the kind of poise that could make her seem older. Her skin was pale, but not in the way of sickness, it was the luminous pallor of someone accustomed to dim interiors and shaded gardens. Her eyes were the color of wet slate. And her manner, it was not aloofness exactly, but a kind of self-containment, as if she had been dropped into this world from another and was still deciding whether to speak its language. The servants noticed first the oddness of her dress. The fabric was fine, but unfamiliar, its weave tighter, smoother than the wool and silk common in England at the time. The bodice fastenings were arranged in a way no local seamstress would have chosen, and the buttons were made of a pale, hard material no one recognized. She wore no jewelry, save for a thin silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar. In the evenings, she kept mostly to her rooms, declining invitations to dine formally with the family. When she did appear in the public rooms of the manor, it was usually in the south drawing room, where Elias Turner had set up his easel. And there, in the muted winter light, the painter began his work. Turner was transformed in her presence. Normally a deliberate, even plodding worker, he moved with a kind of urgency, his eyes darting between her face and the canvas with a focus that left no room for conversation. The air in the room seemed denser when she sat for him, the faint smells of turpentine and candle wax sharpening somehow, as if the senses themselves were heightened. Witnesses, few as they were, described moments that would later seem impossible to explain. A maid entering quietly to collect the tea tray swore she heard Turner murmur something to the sitter in a language she didn't know, and that the woman replied in kind, her voice low but oddly resonant. The housekeeper, delivering fresh linens one morning, claimed she saw Turner painting details that were not yet visible on the canvas, as though he knew where each line and shadow would fall before he laid down the first stroke. No one ever saw her arrive or leave the south drawing room. She was simply there when Turner began, and gone when he stopped. The Lavingtons themselves offered no explanations. Henry seemed tense in those days, pacing the library late into the night. Margaret grew pale and quiet, her letters to her sister, now preserved in the county archive, beginning to trail into incomplete sentences, as though interrupted by something she could not put into words. The village, too, began to take notice. Though the woman was never seen in the streets, the gossip moved quickly. A farmer delivering grain to the manor swore he glimpsed her at an upstairs window, watching the yard below with an intensity that made him look away. A seamstress repairing draperies in the great hall said she heard the sound of footsteps above her, measured, deliberate, though no one was quartered in that wing at the time. By the end of February, the atmosphere in Hartwell had changed. The staff moved more quickly along the corridors, as though keen to avoid lingering. Fires were kept burning in rooms that were not in use, though no one explained why. And Turner seemed to be working towards something he would not, or could not, delay. On the morning of March the 3rd, the final sitting took place. The housekeeper, entering just after dawn to light the fire, found Turner already at the easel, his palette crowded with mixed colors, the canvas nearly complete. The woman sat before him in a high-backed chair, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the painter's shoulder. She did not blink. By mid-afternoon, Turner stepped back, his brush lowering slowly to his side. Whatever expression passed between painter and sitter in that moment, no one witnessed. When he finally turned the canvas toward the light, the image was so vivid it seemed almost to breathe. Henry stood in silence for a long moment before nodding once. Margaret excused herself without a word. Turner covered the painting with a cloth. The woman left the room and was not seen again in Hartwell Manor. That evening, the snow began to fall. When the cloth was finally lifted from the canvas and the painting revealed in full, the first reaction was silence. Not the polite hush that accompanies the unveiling of fine art, but the deep, involuntary pause that comes when something strikes too close to the marrow. She sat as Turner had painted her in the south drawing room, a high-backed chair angled slightly toward the viewer, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed just beyond the edge of the frame. The dress was the pale green she had worn during the sittings, the bodice cut to reveal the faint shimmer of the silver chain at her throat. Her hair was swept back with a precision that bordered on ritual. And her face, there it was again, that poised, unreadable expression. It was a masterwork. Even those with no eye for art could see the precision of the brushwork, the richness of the pigments, the uncanny sense of presence. But there was something else. Something that did not belong. It was Margaret Lavington who noticed first. She stood, gloved hands clasped tight before her, eyes narrowed as if peering through a mist. "Henry," she murmured, look at the clasp. On the woman's left shoulder, securing the drape of the dress, was a fastening unlike anything Margaret had seen. It was not the delicate brass or carved bone common to the period. It was smooth, with a polished sheen, and bore a shape so symmetrical it might have been made by a machine, yet machines capable of producing such uniformity did not exist in England in 1792. In the center of the clasp was a faint, engraved emblem, too small to make out from a distance, but its geometry was precise in a way that stirred an unease Margaret could not name. Then Henry saw it too, the background. At first glance, it appeared to be a pastoral landscape, rolling hills, a stand of trees, and what looked like a narrow road winding into the distance. But as one's eyes adjusted, the road seemed too straight, too deliberate. And on it, barely more than a few strokes of dark paint, ran a pair of parallel lines that vanished into the horizon. They were rails. Iron rails, though the railway age in England would not begin for another 3 decades. A footman, summoned to move the painting to another room, later told a fellow servant that he saw something even stranger. In the woman's eyes, so finely painted they caught the light as if wet, there was a glint of reflected scenery. Not the south drawing-room where she had sat, but something else, a skyline of unfamiliar shapes, spires and domes that no map of England could account for. He spoke of it only once, after too much ale, and was quickly shushed by those who preferred their world to remain intact. The anomalies might have been dismissed as the quirks of an imaginative artist. Turner, after all, was known for slipping symbolic elements into his work, subtle gestures to give a portrait depth. But these details did not feel symbolic. They felt precise. Measured. As though they belonged not to the realm of allegory, but to a memory faithfully recorded. Henry was unsettled. Margaret, though she said little, began to avoid the room where the portrait hung. Turner offered no commentary. When asked about the clasp, he simply said, "It was there." When questioned about the rails in the background, he smiled faintly and replied, "Some roads run farther than we think." In the weeks that followed, the portrait became a quiet obsession for those who encountered it. Visitors to the manor would linger before it, sometimes leaning closer, as if trying to catch the scent of the sitter's perfume or hear the rustle of her dress. A few recoiled, muttering something about "those eyes," before changing the subject. One evening, after a dinner with 2 neighboring families, Henry overheard a guest remark in hushed tones that the woman in the painting looked remarkably like the girl from the newspapers last spring. When pressed, the guest could not recall the article's details, only that it had been about a missing young woman, and that her likeness to the sitter was uncanny. This was, of course, impossible. The story had been about an event in London nearly a century after the painting's date. Henry laughed it off, though the sound had a hollow edge. But the most troubling account came from young Thomas Lavington, the elder of Henry's sons, who claimed, on more than one occasion, to have seen the sitter move. Not in great, impossible gestures, but in minute shifts, the tilt of her head altering ever so slightly, the faintest curve lifting one corner of her mouth. When Thomas told his mother, Margaret's face drained of color. She forbade him to go near the south drawing-room. It might have remained a private curiosity, one of those odd family stories that lives and dies behind the walls of an estate, were it not for the arrival of Mr. Callum Price, an antiquarian from Oxford with an interest in unusual works of art. He had come to appraise some of the Lavingtons' holdings for insurance purposes, and when he saw the portrait, he froze. Price was no stranger to anomalies. His work had taken him across Europe, cataloguing relics with disputed histories and objects of dubious origin. But this was different. He studied the brushwork with a magnifying glass, tracing the fine lines of the clasp, the rails in the background, the reflection in the eyes. And when he stepped back, his expression was wary. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that there is no documented technique in 1792 that could have produced this level of mechanical symmetry in metalwork. And as for those rails," he broke off, shaking his head. "It's as if Turner painted something he had no earthly right to know." Henry asked if it could be explained as allegory, or perhaps coincidence. Price gave a small, humorless smile. Coincidence is a fragile crutch to lean on, Mr. Lavington. Lean too hard, and it breaks. In the months that followed, the portrait seemed to cast a long, invisible shadow over Hartwell. Margaret avoided it entirely. Henry grew restless, his correspondence increasingly terse. Turner, having delivered his work, disappeared from the area, taking with him whatever explanation, if any, he might have offered. And then, as winter yielded to the pale green of spring, something happened that turned unease into alarm. The woman herself, the sitter, was gone. No carriage was seen departing. No farewell was offered. One morning she was simply not in the house. Her room, when checked, was immaculate, as if it had never been slept in. Only the faint indentation in the chair before Turner's easel seemed to suggest she had ever been there at all. The portrait remained, of course, her likeness fixed in oil and pigment. But now, the impossibilities it contained no longer felt like mere oddities. They felt like evidence, of what, no one could say. In time, the Lavingtons would make a decision they would not speak of openly: the painting was to be removed from public view. It would hang in a locked room, curtains drawn, seen only by those who had reason, or courage, to look upon it. But the portrait story, like the rails in the background, had already begun to run farther than anyone imagined. And it would not be content to remain still. In the months following the sitter's disappearance, Hartwell Manor began to feel less like a home and more like a sealed vessel. Rooms that once hosted guests and lively gatherings were closed off. The shutters on the south-facing windows remained drawn, even on the brightest spring days. Conversation at the Lavington table grew sparse, punctuated only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional sigh that seemed heavier than its speaker intended. The servants noticed it first. The house, once humming with the small, constant movements of daily life, now carried an odd stillness. Fires were lit less often, even in the chill mornings, as though heat might draw unwanted attention. Deliveries from the village were halved, with Henry insisting on managing the accounts himself. And though Margaret continued her church attendance each Sunday, she no longer lingered afterward to exchange pleasantries. The portrait remained in the locked drawing-room. Henry had ordered the key kept on his person at all times, and no one, not even his wife, was permitted inside without him. Once, the housemaid Ellen glimpsed the door ajar when Henry was within. She swore she heard him speaking in low tones, though whether to himself or to the painting she could not say. When he noticed her in the hall, he shut the door so quickly the sound of it echoed through the corridor. Margaret's health began to falter. She slept poorly and complained of seeing her, in dreams, always seated, always watching, never speaking. At breakfast one morning, she startled at the sound of the postboy's knock, clutching her teacup so tightly it cracked in her hand. She would later tell her sister, in a letter that survives only in fragments, that she felt as though the house is listening, and the air itself is waiting for something to happen. By early summer, Henry made a decision. He began quietly selling portions of their land, first a parcel to the north, then a stretch of farmland that had been in the family for generations. The transactions were handled discreetly, but in a rural community, such things could not remain hidden. Neighbors speculated about debt, about political trouble, about scandal. Few imagined the truth, that the Lavingtons were planning to leave Hartwell altogether. In August, the family dismissed half the staff without notice. Those who left carried tales to the village, speaking in lowered voices of strange sounds from the locked drawing-room, soft knocks against the floorboards, a faint metallic click like the clasp in the painting. One footman claimed to have seen light spilling out from beneath the door late at night, though no lamp had been lit in the hall. Henry's preparations accelerated. He arranged for the contents of several rooms to be packed and sent ahead to an undisclosed location. The portrait was crated under his direct supervision, the process taking hours longer than necessary as he insisted on layer after layer of protective cloth and padding. Turner's name was never mentioned in these days, nor was the woman who had once sat in the chair before him. The family's departure was sudden. On the morning of September the 12th, the manor gates were opened for a waiting carriage. The Lavingtons emerged with only a handful of personal trunks, their faces drawn but resolute. There was no farewell to the staff who remained, no explanations offered. The carriage rolled down the drive, its wheels leaving shallow tracks in the damp earth, and by nightfall Hartwell stood empty save for 3 caretakers instructed not to enter certain rooms. In the weeks that followed, the manor began its slow decline. The gardens went untended, the paint on the shutters began to peel, and the great hall gathered a fine layer of dust. The villagers who passed along the main road would sometimes pause to glance at the upper windows, half expecting to see a figure looking down. Some claimed they did see her, a pale face, watching silently from behind the glass. The portrait itself was not seen again for nearly a century. No record exists of where it was taken after the family's departure. Art historians who later attempted to trace its path found only dead ends, a shipping manifest with an illegible consignee, a letter from a London dealer referencing the Green Lady, without naming its owner. Whether it hung in another home, lay hidden in storage, or passed quietly through the hands of private collectors, no one could say. By the turn of the 19th century, Hartwell Manor had changed hands twice. The new owners refurbished much of the interior, but the south drawing room was left untouched. Whether out of respect, superstition, or some unspoken understanding, it remained locked, the key long since misplaced. It was in that locked silence that the story of the portrait became more rumor than history. Children in the village dared each other to run up to the manor gates at dusk, claiming they could feel her eyes on them from somewhere inside. Older residents spoke of the Lavingtons in the past tense, as though they had not simply moved away but crossed some invisible threshold into another realm entirely. And so the mystery lay dormant. But mysteries such as this rarely die, they bide their time. And when the portrait surfaced again, almost exactly 100 years later, it would carry with it not just the likeness of a woman, but the shadow of everything Hartwell had tried, and failed, to bury. For nearly a century, the portrait was a ghost in the records, mentioned in half-remembered letters, hinted at in art dealer inventories that offered no image, and whispered about in the kind of stories that begin with, "My grandfather once told me." By the time the year 1893 arrived, few outside the Lavington bloodline even believed the painting had existed. It resurfaced, not in a grand London gallery or the estate of some titled collector, but in a modest auction house on a narrow street in Clerkenwell. The building was a repurposed warehouse with high, dusty windows and the faint smell of old wood mingled with pipe smoke. Its proprietor, Mr. Alastair Crane, dealt in everything from Georgian silver to stacks of yellowing newspapers, but he had a sharp eye for the unusual. The portrait arrived one damp March afternoon, borne in by 2 porters who had been paid to clear the contents of a deceased gentleman's townhouse in Bloomsbury. The crate was unmarked, save for the faint remains of an address label so faded it was unreadable. Crane, expecting another run-of-the-mill landscape or a tired family likeness, pried the crate open himself. The effect was immediate. The room seemed to tighten around him. She was as Turner had painted her, a century earlier, down to the clasp at her shoulder, the impossible rails in the background, the gleam in her eyes that suggested awareness. The varnish had aged to a deep amber, giving the work a warmth that seemed to glow in the dim warehouse light. But the painting was in extraordinary condition, as though it had been kept safe from damp, dust, and sunlight for its entire hidden life. Crane was not easily unnerved, but there was something in the woman's gaze that made him feel as though he had interrupted a long silence. He set the canvas aside, intending to research the artist, but before he could, fate, or coincidence, placed the portrait into the public eye. The auction listing appeared in the Illustrated London News, accompanied by a small woodcut reproduction. The caption was simple, "Portrait of an unknown lady, signed E. Turner, 1792. The article noted its fine preservation and the unusual landscape detail, but otherwise treated it as a curiosity among dozens of lots scheduled for sale. It might have passed without incident, were it not for a certain photograph published in the Strand magazine just 1 week earlier. The photograph was of a young woman named Eleanor Winslow, the daughter of a railway magnate and a fixture of London society. Born in 1892, she had come of age in the kind of privilege that placed her in drawing rooms, charity galas, and, on that particular occasion, on the glossy pages of a popular magazine. The likeness was not merely striking. It was exact. The same oval face. The same slate-gray eyes. The same scar, small but distinct, above the right eyebrow. Even the tilt of her head in the photograph mirrored the pose of the painted sitter. The only difference was the clothing, Eleanor in the high-necked lace of the late Victorian age, the painted woman in her pale green gown of impossible origin. It took only days for the connection to be made. Readers of The Strand who also perused the auction listings began to write to the editor, their letters tinged with a mixture of fascination and unease. How could a portrait from 1792 depict, with such impossible fidelity, a woman who had been born exactly 100 years later? When the story reached the Winslow family, they were said to be amused at first. Eleanor herself was less so. Accounts from friends suggest that when shown the image of the portrait, she turned pale and insisted it was a trick, some artist had copied her photograph and aged the canvas artificially. But when told of the signature, the date, and the provenance that stretched back to a painter dead long before her birth, her amusement gave way to a quiet, troubled reserve. The day of the auction, the atmosphere in the small warehouse was unlike any Crane had experienced. Collectors, curiosity seekers, and reporters crowded the narrow aisles. The portrait, displayed on a stand beneath the high windows, seemed almost to glow in the shifting light. When the bidding began, it climbed rapidly, the numbers driven as much by the notoriety of the coincidence as by the quality of the work. It was purchased by an anonymous bidder, rumored to be acting on behalf of the Winslow family, for a sum that, while not extravagant by the standards of high art, was remarkable for a piece without a named sitter. The crate was sealed once more, and by nightfall, the portrait was gone from public view. But the story was far from over. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread through the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the columns of the less reputable papers. Eleanor Winslow, they said, had been seen staring at the portrait for hours at a time, her expression unreadable. A maid in the Winslow household claimed she had overheard Eleanor asking her mother whether this had happened before. Another servant swore she had seen Eleanor touch the clasp in the painting, her fingers hovering inches from the canvas, as though she expected to feel it under her hand. The more imaginative gossips claimed the resemblance between sitter and subject was not the result of coincidence or forgery, but something far stranger, that the portrait was a kind of anchor, a link between 2 points in time. They whispered of reincarnation, of time slips, of bargains made in secret. Eleanor herself withdrew from the social calendar. Invitations went unanswered. Her public appearances dwindled. And when she did attend an event, she seemed distracted, her eyes drawn again and again to some fixed point just beyond the company at hand, as though she were listening for something. By the end of that year, the portrait had acquired a new name in certain circles, The Lady Who Waits. Those who had seen it claimed the title was apartment. There was, they said, a sense that the sitter was not merely posing, but anticipating. Waiting for someone, or something, to arrive. For the Winslows, the connection between Eleanor and the portrait became a private matter, shielded from the press as much as possible. But for the public, the mystery had taken on a life of its own. Theories flourished, each more elaborate than the last. Some claimed Turner had been a visionary, glimpsing the future through some unknown gift. Others insisted the painting was proof of a repeating soul, bound to return every 100 years. A few, less romantically inclined, dismissed the entire affair as a clever hoax, but even they admitted the physical evidence made such a claim difficult to sustain. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable: the woman in the portrait and the woman in the photograph were, in every visible way, the same. And that was enough to ensure the story would not be forgotten. At first, Eleanor Winslow treated the matter of the portrait with careful dismissal. In conversations with acquaintances, she would laugh lightly at the absurdity of it, call it a charming curiosity, and nothing more. But those who knew her well could see the strain behind the performance. There was a hesitation in her speech now, a faint, deliberate choosing of words, as though she were guarding against saying something that would invite deeper questions. Within the Winslow household, the portrait was kept in the east drawing room, a space reserved for private family gatherings. It was hung above the mantel, away from direct sunlight, and always covered when visitors came. Eleanor insisted on the covering at first, claiming she found it distracting. But over the weeks, the cloth was removed more often than not, and when it was, she could be found there for long stretches, simply standing before it. Servants began to notice changes. She no longer lingered in the breakfast room with her father to read the day's papers. She forgot appointments. Once, she was seen in the hall mirror, adjusting her hair into the exact style worn by the painted sitter, though she quickly abandoned it when she realized she was being watched. Friends who visited spoke afterward of an unease they could not define. Eleanor was gracious, even warm, but her attention wandered. More than one guest remarked on the uncanny sensation of speaking to her while the portrait loomed in the background, two identical faces in the same room, one alive, one fixed in oil. There were moments when she seemed to lean into the resemblance. One evening, at a small dinner her mother hosted, Eleanor entered wearing a pale green gown in a shade so close to the painted dress that the effect was immediate and unsettling. The clasp at her shoulder, though not identical, had been chosen with deliberate care. "I wanted to see," she told her cousin afterward, "if they would notice." When asked who they were, she smiled thinly and said nothing more. Her parents grew concerned. Mr. Winslow, a practical man, pressed her to dismiss the whole affair as coincidence and move on. Her mother took a gentler approach, encouraging her to travel, Paris, perhaps, or the Riviera, to shake loose the fixation. Eleanor agreed at first, but each time plans were made, she found a reason to postpone. Privately, she kept a small notebook, the contents of which were never intended for other eyes. Its pages, discovered decades later in a sealed trunk, revealed the depth of her preoccupation. She described dreams in which she was seated in an unfamiliar room with tall windows, the sound of distant wheels on rails echoing outside. Sometimes she dreamed of standing in a garden under a sky the color of metal, speaking to a man whose face she could never quite see. More troubling were the entries in which she spoke of recognition, not of the portrait itself, but of the act of sitting for it. "I remember the weight of the dress," one entry reads, "the smell of oil paint, the faint tremor in the painter's hand. I remember it though I cannot have been there." Her writing suggested she was beginning to entertain possibilities she would not discuss aloud. She speculated on the nature of time, whether it might fold or loop, whether moments could be experienced more than once in different bodies. "What if," she wrote in one passage, "we are not born into the world, but return to it at appointed intervals, like a clock striking the same hour over and over? And what if some part of us remembers?" By the autumn of 1894, her public appearances had dwindled to almost nothing. Invitations to balls and musicales went unanswered. She took long, solitary walks in the garden, often stopping to look toward the horizon as though expecting someone to arrive. The portrait remained uncovered in the east drawing room, its surface kept meticulously clean, the varnish polished until the sitter's eyes seemed almost wet. It was during this time that rumors began to circulate, quietly at first, then more insistently, that the resemblance between Eleanor and the portrait was beginning to shift in a strange way. Those who had seen both claimed that while Eleanor's features were unchanged, the sitter's expression in the painting had grown subtly different. Some said the eyes appeared sharper, the half-smile more pronounced. A few insisted that the painted woman now looked faintly older, though no crack or flaw in the surface suggested any tampering. Whether Eleanor believed these changes or not, she never spoke of them. But she grew increasingly private, her manner alternating between restless energy and long spells of stillness. Servants sometimes found her seated before the painting in the dark, the curtains drawn, her face barely visible in the faint firelight. In January of 1895, an incident occurred that the Winslow family would keep from public record. One afternoon, Eleanor was discovered in the east drawing room, standing on a small ladder before the portrait. She had removed the frame from the wall and was leaning close to the sitter's clasp, as if examining the engraved emblem. When her mother entered, Eleanor stepped down abruptly and replaced the painting without a word. That night, she locked the drawing room door from the inside and did not emerge until morning. From then on, the the portrait became almost a private companion to her. She stopped referring to it as the painting and began calling it her in casual remarks. "She's waiting," she once said to a startled footman, "but I don't yet know for what." Eleanor's father, increasingly alarmed, attempted to remove the portrait from the house entirely. The plan was to place it in storage with a dealer friend until the matter faded from public interest. But when the day came, Eleanor locked herself in the east drawing room and refused to allow it to be taken. The confrontation ended quietly, with her father retreating and the portrait remaining where it was. It was around this time that Eleanor began refusing to sit for photographs. The last known image of her was taken in the spring of 1893, the same year the portrait reappeared. Friends speculated that she feared seeing herself frozen in another likeness, as though too many versions of her image might tether her to something she could not control. By the close of the decade, Eleanor Winslow was a figure half withdrawn from the world, her life shaped by the silent presence of a woman painted a century before her birth. Whether she was the victim of coincidence, a subject of some unexplainable phenomenon, or a participant in a mystery of her own making, no one could say. But those who saw her in those years agreed on one thing: when she stood before the portrait, there was no doubting the connection. It was not merely resemblance. It was recognition. By the turn of the century, the story of the Turner portrait had moved beyond the drawing rooms of London society. It had become a matter of public fascination, crossing into newspapers, periodicals, and the newly popular illustrated weeklies. The tale of a painting from 1792 depicting a woman born in 1892 was the sort of anomaly that captured both the rational mind and the romantic imagination. It was, as one journalist put it, a puzzle with too many straight edges and no centerpiece. The first to weigh in were the art experts. The portrait was brought under the scrutiny of conservators from the British Museum and private galleries. They examined the canvas under magnifying lenses, tested samples of the varnish, and traced the brushstrokes with meticulous care. Their conclusion was unanimous: the materials, pigments, and techniques were consistent with the late 18th century. The lead white beneath the layers of paint, the verdigris green of the gown, the delicate craquelure, these were not the forgeries of a clever imitator. The painting, they said, was genuinely of its time. For a moment, this seemed to settle the question of fraud. But it opened a darker one: if the work was authentic, then the likeness to Eleanor Winslow could not be explained away by backdating. The skeptics, undeterred, offered other theories. Some suggested a distant family connection between the Winslows and the original sitter, that Eleanor was unknowingly the descendant of the woman in the painting, and the resemblance was merely the echo of heredity. It was an elegant theory, until genealogists pored over baptismal records, marriage ledgers, and parish rolls. They found no match. The Lavingtons, the family in whose manor the portrait had been painted, had no documented link to the Winslows. Others claimed the likeness was exaggerated by suggestion. "Once you tell the mind to see similarity," wrote one critic in the Times, "it will find it even in strangers." Yet this explanation faltered when photographs of Eleanor and reproductions of the portrait were shown, without context, to people who knew neither name nor story. The majority identified them as the same woman. In the early years of the 20th century, the spiritualist movement seized on the case. Séances were held in which mediums claimed to speak to the painter, Elias Turner, or to the sitter herself. Some alleged that the portrait was not merely a depiction, but a kind of vessel, a place where a consciousness could reside. These sessions produced grand pronouncements but no evidence. And yet, for those who believed in the permeability of time, the portrait became a talisman, a sign that the past and the future were less separate than they appeared. The more scientifically minded turned to psychology. They speculated about cryptomnesia, hidden memories surfacing in unexplainable ways, or about the peculiarities of perception that might cause one to overstate resemblance. A few, leaning into the new theories of time and relativity emerging from the scientific world, proposed that the painter might have experienced a momentary time slip, catching a vision of a future woman and recording her face without understanding its origin. The most radical suggestion came from Dr. Alaric Bell, a physicist with an interest in temporal anomalies. Writing in a small but respected journal in 1908, Bell hypothesized that certain objects could act as resonant anchors between points in time. A portrait, he argued, with its intense focus on a single human likeness, might preserve not just the physical features of the sitter but the very moment of their existence, allowing that moment to intersect, under rare conditions, with another in the future. The Turner portrait, he suggested, might be one such anchor. Bell's theory was dismissed by most of his peers as poetic speculation, but it found a devoted following among those already inclined toward the mysterious. In certain circles, the portrait began to be spoken of not as a work of art, but as an event, an occurrence in paint that had not yet finished unfolding. Meanwhile, the Winslow family sought to draw the matter to a close. They limited access to the painting, refusing further public exhibitions and declining requests from researchers. Their official stance was that the resemblance between Eleanor and the sitter was a coincidence, remarkable but not supernatural. Privately, however, letters between family members tell a different story. In one, Eleanor's mother writes to her sister, "We have decided to keep her where she is. I fear moving her would be disruptive." The use of her in reference to the portrait is telling. Despite the family's efforts, the legend continued to grow. Stories circulated of those who had been allowed to see the portrait in later years and who claimed that the sitter's eyes followed them more keenly than in earlier reproductions. Some insisted that subtle changes in her expression had occurred over time, as though the woman in the painting were aging, or waiting. In 1923, a final round of scientific testing was attempted, this time with the newly available tools of pigment spectroscopy and high-resolution photography. The results confirmed what had been said decades earlier: every material was consistent with the date 1792. No modern pigments, no synthetic varnishes, no signs of overpainting. The rails in the background were examined closely, and their representation was deemed too precise to be mere accident. The clasp at the shoulder was studied under magnification, revealing an engraved emblem that matched no known heraldic device or manufacturer's mark of the period, or of any period on record. The testing only deepened the mystery. In the absence of an explanation, the scientific reports concluded with the simplest, most unsatisfying statement possible: inconclusive. By then, Eleanor herself was nearing the end of her public life. Her health, both physical and mental, had waned. She rarely spoke of the portrait anymore, though it remained in the East drawing room. Visitors in her final years remarked that she kept the chair before it angled in such a way that she could sit and look at the painting without rising from her seat. When Eleanor Winslow died in 1931, the portrait was once again crated and removed from view. Its next destination was not recorded. Whether by deliberate choice or by chance, it vanished into private hands, leaving behind only photographs, reproductions, and the persistent, unanswered question: how could a painter in 1792 have known the face of a woman not yet born for another 100 years? By the mid-1920s, Eleanor Winslow had retreated almost entirely from the society she once moved through so effortlessly. Her absence from the seasonal gatherings of London's upper circles was remarked upon at first, then quietly accepted. In the rare moments she was seen in public, stepping from a carriage outside a discreet physician's office, or attending an early morning church service, there was an air of fragility about her, as though she were moving through the world with great effort. The Winslow family home on Park Lane grew quieter with each passing year. Servants were dismissed, leaving only a skeleton staff to maintain the house. Curtains in unused rooms remained drawn at all times. The East drawing room, where the Turner portrait hung, was never closed, yet it became a place the household avoided. Even the remaining staff entered only when absolutely necessary, and then quickly, as if lingering too long might invite something they could not see. Those who did glimpse Eleanor in her later years often found her seated before the portrait, not in the formal posture of someone appreciating art, but in the way one might sit opposite an old friend, or an adversary. She would lean forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the sitter's eyes. Sometimes she murmured under her breath, the words too soft to catch. Her appearance changed subtly. The once bright confidence in her expression dimmed, replaced by a kind of watchfulness that mirrored the painted woman's own. Neighbors who saw her during brief walks in the garden remarked that she seemed to pause often, looking over her shoulder as though sensing someone behind her. By 1929, Eleanor's health had begun to fail. The newspapers attributed it to a long-standing, nervous condition, a vague and fashionable diagnosis that explained nothing. In truth, she had grown withdrawn to the point that even family members rarely saw her. Letters from her mother to distant relatives spoke of an exhaustion that sleep does not touch and a persistent feeling of being observed, even in solitude. In her final months, she took to writing late into the night. The journals from this period, preserved only in fragments, hint at a mind grappling with something she could not reconcile. In one entry, she writes, "I no longer think it a resemblance. I think it is me. Not was, not will be, am." Another reads simply, "She is patient. I am not." On a cold January morning in 1931, Eleanor Winslow was found dead in her bed, the cause recorded as heart failure. She was 39 years old. The portrait, according to the probate inventory, was still in the East drawing room at the time of her death. What happened next is shrouded in uncertainty. The Winslow estate was settled quietly, without the public auction of effects that often followed the death of a prominent figure. The portrait was crated, as it had been once before, but no record survives of where it went. Some believe it was placed in storage by the family and later sold privately to an unknown buyer. Others claim it was gifted, or surrendered, to a collector with an interest in objects of unusual provenance. There are whispers, too, of a more troubling fate. One former Winslow servant, interviewed decades later, recalled overhearing a heated discussion between Eleanor's brother and the family solicitor in the days after her death. The solicitor insisted the painting should be secured, while her brother argued that it should be removed from circulation entirely. What removed meant in this context, the servant could not say. By the spring of 1931, the Turner portrait had vanished from the public record once again. The trail of documentation ended abruptly, as it had in 1792, leaving only scattered rumors and unverifiable sightings. One such rumor placed the painting in the possession of a shipping magnate who displayed it in a locked room aboard his private yacht, showing it only to select guests during late-night gatherings. Another suggested it had been taken abroad to a private collection in the American Northeast, where it hung in a library known for its cabinets of curiosities. None of these accounts were substantiated. What is certain is that, in the absence of the painting, the legend of its connection to Eleanor Winslow grew even more potent. Without the physical work to examine, speculation became boundless. Writers embellished the tale, adding details that blurred the line between history and folklore. Some claimed Eleanor had predicted her own death to the exact day, mirroring an entry in a fictional diary said to belong to the woman in the portrait. Others insisted the sitter's clasp bore an emblem that, when drawn accurately, matched the insignia of a railway company founded decades after Turner's time. In the end, the portrait's second disappearance only deepened its mystery. It became a story told in two halves, the first in 1792, when a painter captured a face that did not yet exist, the second in 1893, when that face walked the earth once more. The century between them seemed less like a gap in time and more like a single, unfinished sentence. For those who had seen it, truly seen it, there was a lingering sense that the story was not over. The woman in the portrait had vanished from sight, but her gaze, once met, was not so easily forgotten. With the disappearance of the Turner portrait in 1931, the story passed almost entirely into the realm of hearsay. For the better part of the 20th century, it existed less as a physical object and more as a shifting legend, part art mystery, part ghost story. The absence of the painting allowed details to mutate, merge, and fracture in the retelling, until no two versions were exactly the same. In rural Gloucestershire, where Hartwell Manor once stood, the locals told it as a cautionary tale. In their version, the woman in the portrait was not a sitter at all but a spirit trapped by the painter, bound to the canvas until her likeness walked the earth again. They claimed she could pass from the painting into the body of her future self, taking her place entirely. In this telling, Eleanor Winslow's decline was not illness, but possession. In London, the art world kept its own, more sophisticated version. Here, the portrait was spoken of as Turner's anachronism, a work whose technical perfection masked deliberate impossibility. Dealers whispered of its background rails, the emblem on the clasp, the impossible likeness to a woman not yet born. Some hinted that there were other such works, portraits or sketches, by obscure painters who had glimpsed faces out of their own time, though none had achieved the same fidelity or notoriety. Among spiritualists, the portrait took on an almost relic-like status. Mediums incorporated its story into lectures, holding it up as proof that time was not a straight road but a tangled web. Seance circles attempted to call the sitter or the painter, claiming messages that were vague, cryptic, or eerily precise, depending on the teller. One notorious seance in 1954 ended when the medium, mid-trance, cried out in a voice that was not her own, "I remember the rails. I remember the day they began." There were also stories that placed the portrait in far-flung locations. A persistent rumor claimed it had been smuggled to South America during the Second World War, part of a shipment of valuables hidden from both Axis and Allied hands. Another told of an American collector in New England who kept it in a climate-controlled vault, bringing it out only on the anniversary of Eleanor Winslow's death. These accounts, unverifiable and often contradictory, only added to the work's mystique. In the absence of proof, the public imagination filled the gaps. The woman in the painting acquired new identities in the telling: a French revolutionary spy, a lost royal heir, a woman who had made a bargain to live twice in exchange for something unnamed. The emblem on her clasp became the subject of endless amateur speculation, with some claiming it matched symbols found in Masonic archives, others insisting it resembled markings on experimental railway schematics from the mid-19th century. By the 1970s, the story had become a minor obsession among certain fringe researchers and anomalists, who catalogued the portrait alongside other alleged time-displaced artifacts. Books with titles like Echoes Through the Canvas and The Woman Who Waited devoted entire chapters to it, weaving archival fragments with interviews of people who claimed, sometimes convincingly, sometimes less so, to have seen the painting in their youth. One such account came from a retired dockworker in Liverpool, who insisted that in 1946 he had been hired to move crates from a warehouse to a ship bound for Boston. Among them was a tall, narrow crate whose top had been dislodged. Inside, he swore, was the portrait, its eyes catching the light from the open door. "She was looking past me," he said. "Not at me, past me, like she could see something on the horizon I couldn't." In Gloucestershire, children still dared each other to walk up the overgrown drive to the remains of Hartwell Manor, long since gutted by fire. The south drawing room had collapsed decades earlier, but they told each other that if you stood in the right place at dusk, you could hear the faint scrape of a chair against the floorboards, or catch a flicker of green fabric in the corner of your eye. Even among the skeptical, the Turner portrait retained a peculiar gravity. Historians could explain away most supposed anomalies with enough research, but the convergence of hard evidence, the painting's verified 18th-century materials, the documented existence of Eleanor Winslow, the photographic record of her uncanny resemblance, remained stubbornly resistant to dismissal. Coincidence, one art historian admitted reluctantly in a BBC interview in 1982, is a perfectly sound word. But in this case, it feels like an inadequate one. Over time, the portrait became less a single mystery and more a mirror for the preoccupations of each generation. In the anxious years of the Cold War, it was framed as a warning about forces outside human control. In the New Age optimism of the 1990s, it became a symbol of human continuity, of lives looping and reconnecting. And yet, beneath the shifting interpretations, the core of the story remained unchanged. In 1792, a painter created a portrait of a woman who had not yet been born. In 1893, that woman, or her perfect likeness, stood before it in the flesh. In 1931, she died, and the portrait vanished again. Those who believed the story was finished took comfort in its symmetry. Those who did not pointed to the century between sittings, and noted that such intervals have a way of keeping their appointments. By the early 21st century, the Turner portrait had taken on the quality of a ghost story whose details were scattered across centuries. But then, in the spring of 2007, an unmarked crate arrived at a small art restoration studio in Bath. Its sender requested confidentiality. The instructions were simple: assess the condition of the work, restore only where necessary, and photograph every stage of the process. When the crate was opened, the restorer, Anna Whitfield, found herself staring into the cool grey-blue eyes of a woman she had seen only in grainy black and white reproductions. The clasp at her shoulder gleamed faintly under the aged varnish. The parallel rails in the background were still there, crisp and deliberate. Even the emblem engraved on the clasp was unchanged, its lines sharp and unreadable. Anna contacted the client to confirm the work's provenance. The reply came in a short email: "The family prefers not to be identified. Focus on the work, not its history." Despite the anonymity, Anna's photographs began to circulate quietly among certain art historians. The renewed access drew a new wave of analysis, this time armed with tools Turner's contemporaries could never have imagined. Ultra-high-resolution imaging revealed microscopic details in the brushwork, single, deliberate strokes that suggested the clasp's emblem was not merely decorative, but constructed from a sequence of repeating geometric patterns. Pigment spectroscopy confirmed again what every prior examination had shown: every material was consistent with the year 1792. No synthetic binders. No modern pigments. No signs of overpainting or later additions. The painting, for all scientific purposes, was exactly what its date claimed it to be. But digital facial recognition technology added a new, disquieting layer. A research team at a university in Cambridge ran a comparison between the sitter's face and surviving photographs of Eleanor Winslow. The result was an almost perfect match, over 98 similarity in measurable facial points. Statistically, such a correspondence was nearly impossible without a direct genetic link. And yet, once again, no such link could be found. The findings reignited public interest. Documentaries were pitched. Feature articles appeared in major papers, each offering their own angle. Was this proof of reincarnation? Time travel? Or merely the most remarkable coincidence in portraiture's long history? Skeptics doubled down. A historian from the Courtauld Institute suggested that the portrait had been altered subtly during its missing years to more closely resemble Eleanor, a theory undermined by the absence of any detectable overpainting. A cultural critic dismissed the entire phenomenon as an exercise in confirmation bias, powered by a century of rumor. Yet others saw in the renewed attention the possibility of answers. A small group of researchers proposed that the emblem on the clasp might be a key, literally. The geometric design, when digitally reconstructed, resembled certain railway company logos from the 1840s, as well as obscure symbols from 18th-century engineering blueprints. Whether this was intentional or a strange convergence of design history remained unresolved. The more the portrait was studied, the more it seemed to resist resolution. High-magnification scans of the sitter's eyes revealed what one analyst described as micro-landscapes, minuscule variations in color and texture that, when enhanced, appeared almost like a reflection of a city skyline. The shapes were indistinct, but some claimed they resembled structures not built until the late 19th century. Then there was the matter of the sitter's expression. Software designed to analyze micro-expressions in human faces returned an odd reading. The sitter's gaze was not passive, as in most portraiture, but anticipatory, as though reacting to something beyond the frame. One psychologist who reviewed the results commented, "It's as if she knows you're going to be here, looking at her, in a future she's already seen." Anna completed her restoration, carefully cleaning the varnish and repairing a small tear at the edge of the canvas. The painting emerged brighter, its colors truer, the pale green of the gown now luminous against the darker tones of the background. The clasp caught the light in a way that made its emblem seem almost mobile, shifting subtly as the viewer changed position. When the work was returned to its owner, still unnamed, it vanished once more from public record. Whether it now hangs in a private home, a secure vault, or another quiet corner of the world, no one will say. And yet, in the years since, scattered reports have surfaced. A dinner guest in a country house outside Oxford swore she saw the portrait above the mantel, only for it to be gone the next day. A visitor to a private club in Edinburgh claimed a locked side room contained a woman in green, watching the door. A grainy photograph appeared online in 2016, purporting to show the painting reflected in a mirror at an estate sale. The image was quickly removed. In each account, one detail recurs: the sitter's expression. Those who have seen her in recent decades say her eyes seem sharper now, her half-smile deeper, as though whatever she was waiting for is closer than it once was. For those inclined to patterns, the timing is troubling. If the gap between her appearances is a century, as some believe, the next interval is approaching. Whether that means another likeness will walk the earth, or the portrait itself will emerge again, no one knows. What is certain is this: 2 centuries after Elias Turner set brush to canvas, his work remains what it always was, a riddle in oil, a moment captured from both past and future, suspended in the fragile space between. And if you should ever find yourself in a quiet room, standing before a painting of a woman in a pale green gown, look closely at her eyes. You may feel, as so many have before you, that she is not simply a subject, but a witness. A witness waiting for something only she knows. And perhaps, in that moment, you will wonder, if she has been waiting for you.